Cold War had already scarred Europe, shaken Asia, and terrified the world with the Cuban Missile Crisis. But the story was far from over. The 1960s, 70s, and 80s would test humanity like never before, through jungles, deserts, and even the stars. And in the end, the empire that once rivaled the United States would collapse into dust. But how did the unthinkable happen? Vietnam became the most devastating proxy war of the Cold War. What started as U.S. support for South Vietnam against communist North Vietnam escalated into a full-scale conflict. Jungle warfare, guerrilla tactics, and relentless bombings turned the conflict into a nightmare. By the late 1960s, U.S. soldiers were trapped in a war they couldn't win, and American society itself began to fracture under the weight of anti-war protests. At the same time, Soviet influence spread into Africa and the Middle East. The world became a giant chessboard, US-backed regimes versus Soviet-supported revolutions. From Angola to Afghanistan, coups and wars erupted, leaving millions caught between rival ideologies. The Cold War was no longer just about two superpowers, it was about shaping the destiny of every corner of the globe. The arms race only intensified. Both sides built nuclear arsenals capable of destroying the planet several times over. In 1969, the world counted more than 30,000 nuclear warheads. American and Soviet submarines prowled beneath the seas, ready to launch at a moment's notice. Fear turned into a daily reality, symbolized by the doomsday clock, ticking closer and closer to midnight. But not every moment was filled with hostility. The 1970s brought détente, a temporary thaw in relations. U.S. President Richard Nixon visited Moscow and Beijing, signaling a new era of diplomacy. Arms control treaties like SALT I slowed the nuclear buildup. For a brief time, the world hoped the Cold War could end without catastrophe. But history would prove that peace was only temporary. In 1979, the Soviet Union invaded Afghanistan, hoping to protect a fragile communist regime. But the invasion became their Vietnam. Mujahideen fighters, backed by U.S. weapons and training, bled the Soviet army dry. For 10 years, mountains echoed with gunfire, Stinger missiles downed Soviet helicopters, and thousands of young soldiers never returned home. The Soviet dream of expansion turned into a bleeding wound. The 1980s marked the rise of a new American strategy. President Ronald Reagan declared the Soviet Union the evil empire and launched the Strategic Defense Initiative, nicknamed Star Wars. Billions were spent on advanced weapons, satellites, and missile defense systems. The Soviets, already burdened by economic stagnation, struggled to keep up. The arms race had now become an economic war, and Moscow was losing. Meanwhile, unrest spread across Eastern Europe. In Poland, the Solidarity movement challenged Soviet control, with workers demanding freedom and dignity. In East Germany, whispers of escape through barbed wire and guarded checkpoints grew louder. People were no longer afraid, they wanted change, and the Soviet Union could no longer silence them all. In 1985, Mikhail Gorbachev came to power. With his policies of glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring, he tried to reform the Soviet Union. But instead of saving the empire, these reforms unleashed forces he could not control. Soviet citizens demanded more freedom, republics sought independence, and the iron grip of communism began to crumble from within. The final blow came in 1989. One by one, Eastern Bloc nations broke free. The most iconic moment came in Berlin, when ordinary citizens climbed the hated wall and began tearing it down brick by brick. Tears of joy flowed, families reunited, and the symbol of the Cold War collapsed before the eyes of the world. The Iron Curtain had fallen at last. By December 1991, the Soviet Union itself ceased to exist. The red flag over the Kremlin was lowered for the last time, replaced by the Russian tricolor. The Cold War was over, but the world was forever changed. For nearly 50 years, humanity lived in the shadow of annihilation, where one wrong move could have destroyed everything. But if the Cold War had ended, what came next? The answer would shape the 21st century. Subscribe for more untold war stories.